The Mountain Lion by Jean Stafford. Chapter 1. Ralph was 10 and Molly was 8 when they had scarlet fever. It left them with some sort of glandular disorder which was not malignant, but which kept them half poisoned most of the time and caused them frequently to have such bad nosebleeds that they had to be sent home from school. It nearly always happened that their nosebleeds came at the same time. Ralph, bleeding profusely, would stumble into the corridor to find Molly coming out of the third grade room, a handkerchief held in a sodden bunch at her nose. Their mother could not bear the sight of blood, and her distress, on seeing them straggle up the driveway, never lessened, even when these midday homecomings had become a habit. Each time, she implored them to telephone her so that she could send Miguel, the foreman, in the car. But they never did, for they liked the walk home, feeling all the way a pleasant superiority to their sisters, Leah and Rachel, who were still cooped up in school with nothing at all to do but chew paraffin on the sly. In the September following their illness, and on the day Grandpa Kenyon, their mother's stepfather, was to arrive for his annual visit, they met with gushing noses outside the art supply room, and seeing Miss Holohan through the open door at the paper cutter with a sheaf of manila paper, they walked on tiptoe, giggling silently until they reached the stairs, and then they ran. Once outside in the empty schoolyard, they congratulated each other. Molly would not have to draw an apple on Miss Holohan's paper, and Ralph would miss both Palmer method and singing. Actually, they would gain nothing by getting home some hours before the school bus, since Grandpa's train did not get into Los Angeles until the middle of the afternoon. And then it was another hour before Miguel brought him up the driveway in the Willis night. So they dawdled more slowly than usual, not certain that they would find anything to absorb them at home, but certain, on the other hand, that their mother, fussing and chattering as she always did when they had company, would be as cross as 60 when she saw them. It was a narrow, winding country road they walked along. On either side ran clear small ditches, making a mouth-like sound. Now and again they stopped and dipped their handkerchiefs and wiped the blood off their hands and arms. On the right was an orange grove from which, at all seasons of the year, came a heavy fragrance, and where they sometimes saw flocks of such bright, unusual birds that they thought they must have flown up from the South Seas or westward from Japan. Some of the little pyramidal trees were always in bloom, and some were always bearing fruit. There was a man on a ladder in the grove today, and he turned when he heard them coming. He took off his hat and wiped his forehead on the sleeve of his black shirt and called, "Hello, you kiddos," but as he was a Mexican, they did not reply, and scuttered on terrified until they no longer heard his derisive laugh. Next they passed Mr. Vogelman's huge, clean dairy. Mr. Vogelman was a fat German who wore a white coverall and who had once been stoned by a group of second graders when they learned what the Huns had done to the Belgians. Their mothers, fearing that he might take his revenge by treating the milk with tuberculosis germs, had written him an apology. But as the demonstration had taken place on Halloween, Mr. Vogelman had misconstrued it and did not understand the letter at all. He had Guernseys whose hides gleamed in the sun like a metal, not so yellow as a banana, and not so blue as milk, but something in between. Today there was a new calf near the fence, its fawn-like face wearing a look of melancholy surprise when it saw the human children staring. Its outraged mother bellowed at them, her great black nostrils hugely dilated, and they ran away, for, although they would never have admitted it, they were afraid of cows. They knew a joke about a cow which they had read in The American Boy, and when they were safely beyond the pasture, they recited it as a dialogue. Ralph: "What are shoes made of?" Molly: "Hide." Ralph: "Hide? Why should I hide?" Molly: "Hide, hide, the cow's outside." Ralph: "Oh, let the old cow come in, I'm not afraid." They laughed so hard that they had to sit down in the road, holding their stomachs, and the laughter made their noses bleed twice as fast, so that, convulsed and aching, they dabbed desperately with their handkerchiefs, screaming with pain. "Oh, oh!" Finally, when they were sobered, Ralph said, "I guess I'll tell that joke to Grandpa." And Molly said, "Me too." Of late, Ralph had had moments of irritation with her. Often, when he had finished telling a joke or a fact, she would repeat exactly what he had said immediately afterward, so that there was no time for people either to laugh or to marvel. And not only that, but she had countless times told his dreams, pretending that they were her own. He did not want the joke about the cow to fall flat, and so, after a reluctant pause, he agreed to let her tell it with him as they had recited it just now. It was not as long as one of the darky pieces Leah and Rachel spoke together, but it was so much funnier that they were sure Grandpa could not fail to laugh in that big, roaring way of his, slapping his knee and saying, "By George, that's a good one." They proceeded, thinking of Grandpa, joyfully scuffing the white dust of the road, until their Oxfords were all powdery, even the shoelaces. Next to the dairy was a deep, dry arroyo called the Wash. It had been hollowed out by a flood that had come in the spring of the year Leah was 3, but they had so often heard the details of its devastation that they were certain their impressions came from memory, and not from their mothers' and her friends' talk when there was nothing new to discuss, and they had to return to the thrills of the past. Mr. Fawcett had gone across a raging creek on a horse named Babe, long since dead, to rescue an aged woman whose house was later washed away. He brought her home, flung over his saddle like a gunny sack of feed, and gave her artificial respiration on the kitchen floor. Thousands and thousands of finches came out of the pouring rain to perch on the front porch. There were so many Father said it looked like a regular bird sanctuary. Fuchsia was baking a cherry pie, and Father asked her if she wanted 24 finches to put in it. A grapefruit tree came floating right down the driveway, roots and all, and Father planted it beside the solar tank. Every year it bore one grapefruit, which was smaller than a golf ball and almost as hard. On the floor of the wash, Ralph and Molly could find bright-colored stones, pink and green and yellow and blue. After a heavy rain, there was sometimes fool's gold in the puddles. Strange, harsh, shallow-rooted flowers grew all over the steep slopes, and clumps of mallow that yielded bitter milk. There was one place where the mud dried and cracked into wedges like pieces of pie, and when Molly was very small, she thought that this was where sandwiches lived. All mystery and evil came from the wash. Those smooth-colored stones they gathered were really stolen jewels, and the thief was a coal-black scalawag who slept in the daytime in Mr. Volgeman's corn bin but kept watch at night. They did not venture down into the wash when they had nosebleeds because the scalawag could smell blood, no matter how far away he was, and he would get up and come legging it after them. So they passed it quickly with sidelong glances. Last autumn, when they had taken Grandpa Kenyon to see the wash, he had said, "Well now, there's something like it. There's too damn much green in this here California, but that dried up little old creek bed down there makes me think of a place that is a place." He swept his black eyes round the scene and breathed shallowly, as if the sweetness of the orange blossoms offended him, and he said, "To think there ain't any winter here. Why, I'd as like go to hell in a handbasket as not to see the first snow fly." The children were a little angry and shy, and sensing this, he explained to them, though they did not understand what he meant, that nature here offered man no real challenge. You take that place of mine in the Panhandle. Nature ain't any ornerier anywhere in the world than she is right there, but she's a blooming belle of a fighter. When he had bought the land, there had been not a drop of water on the whole 45,000 acres of it, not a stream, not a pond. Everyone said he was a boob to buy it. But he turned in and bought it anyhow, and then he took a little forked switch of holly, and he chose a place on the rise, just to the west of where he meant to build his house. He stood there with his holly wand, holding a fork of it in either hand. By and by, the rod bent down. Where she showed him, there was a deep, clear spring that had never yet gone dry. The wash after that had a new meaning for Ralph and Molly, and they came to believe that the scalawag was so watchful because he feared someone might come with a divining rod and once water was found, all his gems would be washed away. And now, too, whenever they went past, they thought of Grandpa's ranch in the Panhandle, and Ralph, sighing, would say, "Golly Moses, I'd like to go out west." For they believed Grandpa Kenyon when he told them that California was not the West, but was a separate thing like Florida and Washington, D.C. For example, out west you would not find such falderall as Miss Runyon went in for. Miss Runyon lived next to the wash in a little white house with green shutters and begonias in all the windows, and Molly had loved it before Grandpa called it a devil of a note. The flower garden came straight down to the road, and standing among the beds of phlox and bachelor's buttons and oxalis were all sorts of curious creatures. A huge green frog, 3 brownies, a duck and 4 ducklings, 2 bluebirds as big as cats, a little Dutch girl in a sunbonnet, and a totem pole. There was a sign over the front door of the house which said, "Do drop in." Next to the house was a dog house built exactly like Do Drop In, and over its door was a sign that said, "Dun Rovin'," because Miss Runyon's sheepdog was named Rover. Under the eaves on the front porch was a birdhouse built like the other 2, but its name was not so ingenious. It was simply called Jenny Wren, her house. Miss Runyon was the postmistress and was known as a character. She drove an automobile herself, which she called Mac, short for machine, which she humorously pronounced Makini. She ate neither meat nor spices, for she was a follower of Dr. Kellogg. She occasionally invited the Fawcett's to a picnic supper on her lawn, and served them hamburgers which were really made of grape nuts, agglutinated with imitation calf's foot jelly. She always came on Sunday afternoon to read their paper, and made no secret of the fact that she liked the funnies as well as any child, reading them with the same unamused absorption that Ralph and Molly and Leah and Rachel did. Once she said that she was tired to death of Elmer Tuggle and his everlasting baseball mitt. Happy Hooligan was her favorite. In spite of her aggressive good nature, she was very timid and could not sleep alone in a house, so she had living with her a little Japanese woman named Miss Hyson. If ever Mrs. Hyson had to be away, Leah and Rachel went there to sleep, although they never wanted to, for the first time they stayed with her. She suddenly looked up from McCall's in the middle of the evening and said tensely, "Hark, I heard a human swallow." Ralph and Molly thought it was likely that it had been the scalawag swallowing, and the possibilities of what he had been swallowing were so numerous and terrifying that they could not hear the word without trembling. It was thought jestingly by Mrs. Follinsby, the pastor's wife, that Miss Runyon had set her cap for Mr. Kenyon, part of the supposition being based on the rhyming of the 2 names. And it was true that several times during his visits she had invited them to all come and take potluck with her. But they never went, for as Mrs. Fawcett said in the bosom of her family, "I am sure I don't know what a hearty eater like Mr. Kenyon would do if he had to have an evening meal of cereal. I don't care how she disguised it." Ralph thought perhaps he could tell Grandpa a funny story about Miss Runyon, not a true one, but one in which he just used her name, and he stood leaning upon the picket fence, pondering and allowing his nose to drip on the paling so that the 2 of them looked like spears that had struck home. Or maybe he could tell one about Mrs. Hyson. Mrs. Hyson had 2 children about his and Molly's age who lived with their aunt, a tiny little thing who was Mrs. Fawcett's washerwoman. Their names were Mysol and Mysako, and one of them had been on the 4th of July and the other on April Fool's Day. One terrible day they had come with Hannah and had made Ralph and Molly go down to the watermelon patch with them, and not only had they cut up an unripe watermelon with a putty knife, but they had said things and hinted at others so awful that Ralph and Molly had to fight them. They won very easily, of course, because the Jap kids were much smaller. Ralph could not think of a single joke except the one about the cow. He thumbed his nose at Miss Runyon's house and chanted, "Runyon, Tadunyon, Tianigo, Sunyon, Tea-legged, tie-legged, bow-legged Runyon," and then, seizing his sister by the hand, he ran like the wind, because simultaneously Mrs. Hyson had appeared at the door of Do Drop In, and Rover at his door. And while Rover was as harmless as a ladybug, and Mrs. Hyson more than likely had only wanted to give them a candied kumquat, it was pleasanter to think that they were rushing out in anger like the scalawag. And as soon as the house was no longer in sight, Ralph knelt down and put his ear to the road, and jumping up cried, "Hey, they're a-gaining on us!" And they did not stop running until they had turned down their own road. When they had gone 100 steps, they could see the palm trees that marked the boundaries of their land. On this last stretch, Molly always, for some reason, thought of Redondo Beach, where they went for a few weeks at the end of the summer. Looking up into the blank blue sky, she could feel that she was barefoot in the hot sand, hunting starfish and sand dollars, hearing the cries of the frightened ladies to their waiting children who petulantly cried back that the waves were not high. The thought of the beach made her restlessly nostalgic and sometimes made her whimper, because she always remembered a feeling of queer and somehow pleasant horror when once a gull had winked at her, and she had seen that his lower eyelid moved and not the upper one. But today she did not cry. Ralph was too gay, she knew, to comfort her, and that was the only pleasure in crying, to be embraced by him and breathe in his acrid smell of leather, braces, and serge, and to feel, shuddering, the touch of his warty hands on her face. It was always possible for her to will herself not to think sadly of the beach, but to think instead of her dead father, of whom she had no memories, but only the knowledge that he was up in the sky with Jesus, and would miraculously recognize her when she came to heaven, even though she had not been born when he died. This was the most thrilling thought she ever had, and it made her almost delirious ever since the day she and Ralph agreed not to die until he was 99 and she was 97, so that when they got up there they would look much older than their father, who had died at the age of 36. As soon as they turned into the drive, Ralph began the game of dead horse. He said, "I saw a dead horse lying in the road." Molly answered, "I won it." And they went on. "I 2 it. I 3 it." Just as they got to the side of the front porch, Ralph cried out, "I ate it." And Molly screamed hysterically, "Mother, Ralph ate a dead horse again." But their mother was not sitting on the front porch as she usually was, and they looked at each other in numb embarrassment. They should have known that she would be in the kitchen preparing for Grandpa. Now they could hear her bustling across the front hall in her French-heeled slippers, anticipating what she would see and crying, "Oh, I declare I just don't know." And then she stood in the screen door, arms akimbo at her small waist and her pearl gray skirt, unable to decide whether to be angry or worried, too upset for a moment to utter a word. The children waited on the bottom step like well-mannered dogs, and their mother, seeing their humility, chose to be anxious, and flew down the steps, embracing them but carefully, so that she would not stain her white, smocked shirtwaist. She smelled of orris root and gingerbread, and the children, sniffing, sensed the arrival of company even more than they had when they saw Miguel drive out this morning to meet the train. He had gone early to shop for delicacies in the Los Angeles markets. Among other things, they were going to have black cherries and Turkish delight. "Oh, the poor chicks," she cried, her blue eyes quickly full of tears. "Oh, dearies, why didn't you telephone? Why must you aggravate your mother?" Molly said if we had telephoned, it would have been silly because Miguel isn't here and neither is the car, and even if the car was here, it would still be silly because nobody but Miguel can drive it. Molly's logic always made Mrs. Fawcett angry, and now she drove them into the house and upstairs to the bathroom, ejaculating unfinished sentences. "I simply never, no matter how hard I try, today of all days in the year." The nosebleeds almost always stopped as soon as they got home, a phenomenon that obscurely vexed Mrs. Fawcett, and once she had spoken of it in their presence to Mr. Follansby, who had replied, with a catarrhal chuckle, "Well, you know, Rose, that puts me in mind of my sainted mother, who was stone deaf except when she wanted to hear something." Neither Ralph nor Molly had any idea what he meant, but they caught an undertone of ridicule in his voice, and fearing and hating him, they went up to Ralph's room where each of them printed Rev. Follansby 7 times on sheets of drawing paper, and then burned the papers in the gilt Buddha incense burner. Washed and dressed in their company clothes, they went outdoors and sat under the umbrella tree, playing mumbly-peg, hurriedly concealing the knife when their mother came to the door to call some warning about their clean clothes or getting too much sunlight. Mumbly-peg was forbidden, as everything was that was attended by the least possibility of danger. For Grandfather Bonney, their real grandfather, had died of blood poisoning. Jose, the gardener, was trimming the palm trees, and as he deftly wielded his banana knife, he sang songs which they knew were bad, although they could not understand a word of them since he sang in Spanish. They knew because he was a bad man. Once Rachel had dreamed that he pursued her on a bicycle without holding his hands on the handlebars, that same banana knife between his teeth, one hand brandishing a monkey wrench and the other the Civil War saber that had belonged to great Uncle Harry Fawcett, about whom not another fact was known. And once Jose had called Ralph a son of a gun and threatened to burn his eyes out with a red-hot poker if he took any more berries off the bittersweet for his pea shooter. Budge, the kindly cat, lay sleeping on the rim of the frog pond, and the only kitten that had been spared her out of the last litter gazed fixedly down into the slimy green water. Mrs. Fawcett, who did not like animals, even in their own place, believed that Budge had been brought the scarlet fever germs to Ralph and Molly, for goodness only knew what sort of houses she visited in her search for food and tomcats, and she would have had her destroyed if Ralph had not heard her talking with Miguel under his windows one morning, when he was thought to be asleep. Weak with fever, he tottered to the window and called down the stern promise that if Budge were not still on the place when he got well, he would leave at once for the Panhandle and would never come back in 1,000 million years. There were times when Mrs. Fawcett feared for the reason of her two younger children. They had natures of such cold determination that she trembled to think what they might do if they were crossed in a matter very close to their hearts. She could never imagine where they had got this streak, certainly not from her side of the family, and although Mr. Fawcett had by no means been a mollycoddle, he had been very mild-mannered and had always been able to see the other fellow's side of an argument. Budge remained. And then the astonishing Molly had literally read her mother's mind one evening. Mrs. Fawcett was looking at Budge asleep on the hearth, and Molly said, "If anything ever happens to Budge, like poison or something, I'm going to set the pump house on fire." From the cool-looking house, the dark green blinds were drawn to keep out the sun, though the turquoise berry was so dense it admitted little light, came the dulled sounds of Mrs. Fawcett and Fuchsia as they made the dinner. They had been cooking for 2 days. They had made pineapple upside-down cake, boiled dressing, potato salad, beet pickles, baked beans, brown bread, sugar cookies, ladyfingers, Sally Lunn, and temperance punch. Fuchsia had brought in the new schmierkast that had been swinging for 3 days in its muslin bag in the ice house, and she had got 6 bottles of grape juice from the preserve closet to put in the refrigerator. Ralph and Molly, the afternoon before, had cracked a bowl full of last year's walnuts from their own grove, and today Fuchsia had glazed the whole meats and put the broken ones in the panouche. The duck was in the oven baking in a bath of orange juice. Before school, Leah and Rachel had polished the bonny silver and had laid out the morning glory tablecloth. The afternoon seemed to have no end to it, and yet the children were not really impatient to have it pass, for looking forward to Grandpa was, in some ways, as pleasant as having him there in the house. The sun appeared to remain in exactly the same position, and the shadow of the umbrella tree to be unalterable. The bees restless in the blossoms of the Lippia lawn, and the hummingbirds lancing the turquoise berries, worked at top speed as though eternity were not time enough to accomplish all they had to do. Mrs. Fawcett and Fuchsia were forever softly banging things and chirping in muted screams, and Jose was forever at his palm trees. It was very quiet. The Mexicans harvesting the walnuts in the grove were silent. Once a dog began to bark, and it stopped so suddenly it was as if someone had seized his jaws and held them together. "That's Schoneshund," said Ralph. Schoneshund was a mean and hideous mastiff owned by the German family next door, and Mrs. Fawcett was never willing to allow that the name had been chosen ironically. She preferred to think that the Freudenbergs simply did not know any better, for they were not our sort. "If I could not have a carpet in my parlor," she said, "I would have some sort of an inexpensive grass rug, or I would leave the floors bare. I certainly would not have linoleum." Ralph, identifying Schoneshund's bark today, wondered suddenly if Grandpa had any dogs on any of his ranches, and he regretted that in the years past he had asked the old man so few questions that he knew very little about him. The 2 weeks he was here were always so short. Too many new impressions were crowded into the dazzling days, the smells of school that he had forgotten during the summer, the frightening complexities of the new arithmetic book, the surprise of finding in his lunchbox a hard-boiled egg colored magenta with beet pickle juice, and over it all the wonder of the rich old man who was different from anyone else in the world. Always before he had been too unbearably excited to plan a way to catch one of these bright hours, but he promised himself that this year he would gather facts to think about in the winter. The kinds and the names of Grandpa's dogs, for one thing, whether he had ever been to a prize fight, if he had always had a beard, the name of the town in England where he had been born, and how many silver dollars he could carry in his money belt at one time. The sun in time brutalized even Jose, and he stopped singing and worked more slowly. The children's game was languid, and they had given it up long before the school bus came, and Leah and Rachel trudged down the driveway, swinging their school bags in one hand and their lunch boxes in the other. They were cross at Ralph and Molly for coming home early, and did not speak but went directly into the house, and appeared half an hour later bathed and dressed in the new Scotch plaid tissue gingham dresses that Aunt Kathleen had sent them from Marshall Fields. They came out to pick dahlias for the parlor and for the table. They walked past without looking at their sister and brother. Rachel said, "I was going to give Molly my extra cashmere bouquet, just out of the kindness of my heart, but I'm not going to now." And Leah said, "I know, I was going to give Ralph my Colgate shaving soap, but now I wouldn't give either of them anything but a swift kick." Ralph and Molly ignored them, but when they had gone on, Ralph, looking after them with scorn, said, "If I didn't have anything better to do than send for free samples, I'd go jump in the lake." And Molly, agreeing, she and Ralph sent for gun catalogs and booklets on things like how to care for your Glenwood parlor burner, said in a whisper, "Do you think they're going to be sassy to Grandpa?" "I guess they'd better not," said Ralph. "If they do, you and I will make them a pie bed that'll be so tight they'll both break both their legs." Leah and Rachel, almost young ladies, had, along with many other people and many habits, outgrown the soiled and rumpled old gentleman, and looked with the same disfavor their mother did upon his table manners, his rough and ungrammatical speech, his clothes, and his profession, even though it had netted him $3 million. He had 4 cattle ranches, one in Missouri, where he lived, one in Oklahoma, one in Texas, and one in the mountains of Colorado, which his son Claude, Mrs. Fawcett's half-brother, ran for him. How Leah and Rachel could imagine their mother's distress when her mother married this second husband. What a contrast he was to Grandfather Bonney, that noble person in the portrait over the fireplace in the parlor. And how different the life must have been for her and her sisters on his ranch in the northern part of the state, when they had been used to the hustle and gaiety of St. Louis. Last September, when Grandpa left, Leah, watching the car go down the drive, put her arm around her mother's waist and said, "I could simply cry for you, Mother, when I think how you must have missed St. Louis." Mrs. Fawcett, who was wonderfully plucky, smiled fondly down upon her perceptive child and answered, "Well, dear, you know, we can't have everything in this life." From that time onward, the 2 older children heaped upon the absent Mr. Kenyon an articulate and savage ridicule, commingled with resentment which was at once aimless and precocious. Shortly after he had left the Colorado ranch last October, he had gone to Europe, as he frequently did in the winter, and while heretofore these casual trips all over the world had been something to admire and to refer to in conversations with other children who had no such traveled relatives, the girls this year were angry, realizing fully for the first time that their mother had never been abroad. And their anger was inflamed when Mrs. Fawcett from time to time remarked that often in the years she had lived in his house, taking charge of his child, he had taken these long journeys, not giving a thought to her. And you can imagine what those lonesome winters in the country were like for a girl who had been brought up in the city. But Ralph and Molly, in a smaller world, would rather go to reform school than live in St. Louis. The one time they had been there, they had been in tears half the time at all the poor old men selling shoelaces and lengths of elastic, and at all the homeless dogs with sore eyes and limping legs. The smell of smoke and the horrid noises and the terrifying pace of the trolleys had almost made them sick. Their mother, introducing them to Mrs. Waite, their hostess, had said, "And these are my 2 little country bumpkins. They already want to go home. Can you feature it?" They had not really wanted to go home. They had wanted to go visit Grandpa Kenyon, but their mother wouldn't let them, falsely declaring that they would be bored to death, for there would be nothing there to do. There was certainly nothing to do in St. Louis, and all summer long Mrs. Fawcett and Mrs. Waite had whispered conversations about Fatty Arbuckle, so that Ralph and Molly were in a temper the whole time, because when they asked, the ladies only said, "Little pictures have big ears." At Grandpa's place they could have done what they pleased. Their mother didn't know anything. She said that she knew from experience that there was nothing to do, Had she not spent her boarding school holidays there with Aunt Rowena and Aunt Kathleen? All those long, still summers when there was nothing to distract their thoughts from the heat. The immense lawn going down to the river was bare of trees so that one had an unobstructed view of the Mississippi. One of the Bonnie girls' few amusements was to watch the barges and the steamers going down toward Hannibal. Sometimes the sound of a banjo was carried to them on the motionless air, making Rowena, the least controlled of the three, so restless that she would cry, "Oh, why doesn't something happen?" Behind the house was an apple orchard, kept as formally as a garden, and in the center of it was a clearing with a little summer house, where they sometimes sat through the airless afternoons, fanning themselves with palm leaves, homesick for St. Louis. It was 10 miles to the nearest town, and once you got there, there was nothing to look at or to buy, and no one at all congenial to call on. Aunt Rowena and Aunt Kathleen amused themselves by riding horseback and driving the buckboard, but their sister Rose would not join them. She would not, because Grandfather Bonnie's blood poisoning had been the result of a scratch from a nail in the railing of a paddock when he was watching her take her first jump, and ever afterward, feeling that she had been the cause of his far too early death, she vowed that she would have nothing to do with horses. If the Bonnie girls had not all been great readers, they would have been half out of their minds with boredom. Fortunately, Mrs. Bonnie had brought a good part of the library along from St. Louis, and they almost put their eyes out reading Mrs. Gaskell, Dickens, and E.P. Rowe. In some ways, the very worst thing of all was the conversation at mealtime. If the girls had been given half a chance, they might have elevated the tone of it by discussing the books they were reading, but there was never any opportunity. They could not take an interest in the talk of cattle and hogs after the cultured life they had led with their own father. And that was all Mr. Kenyon talked about. Their mother talked right along with him, seeming to be really keen on hearing how many steers were being shipped to Chicago, and how many bulls were being sold off the Texas ranch, and how much feed would have to be brought for the Colorado place over and above the timothy that would be put up in the harvest. Table talk in St. Louis had been quite a different matter. Grandfather Bonnie, who had owned a button factory, never brought his business home. He would say that he wanted to forget the cares that infest the day, and besides that he had great respect for conversation as an art, and once a year on New Year's Day he read selections from Boswell's Journal of a Tour to the Hebrides. He directed the talk at his table as adroitly and interestingly as a professional forum leader. He would start the ball rolling by saying something like this: "Today I was just wondering how much you girls know about Apollo. Do you realize how often he figures in poems, pictures, and statues?" And that would lead to a very enlightening discussion from which the girls derived far more facts than they ever would have done in a cut-and-dried schoolroom class. They talked of everything under the sun, often examining such concepts as justice, charity, and truth. Some of Mrs. Fawcett's most cherished values had been developed at that table. In the late spring of Rose Bonnie's last year in boarding school, 2 years after her father's death and a year after her mother's unseemly second marriage, her mother bore Mr. Kenyon a son. She was then past 40. She had been much younger than her first husband, and to her daughters there seemed something shameful in this middle-aged childbed. Shameful and obscurely disloyal to their dead father. 5 months later, she died a lingering death. Mr. Kenyon, so unimaginative in his innocence, thought that he was honoring Rose in asking her mother's eldest survivor, to keep house for him and rear the baby, Claude. It was not, of course, that he was the least bit stingy and did not want to hire a nurse and a housekeeper, for of course he did that anyway. Poor soul, he really thought Rose would like to do it. Can you imagine anyone understanding girls so little? But how could she refuse? Well, she just couldn't. Thus, for 10 years, she buried herself alive, 10 years of stupefaction enlivened only by the weddings of her 2 sisters, on which Mr. Kenyon had spent nearly a fortune. Grandfather Bonnie would have done it for half as much and with twice as much dash. In all that time, she felt so little intimacy with him that she never called him anything but Mr. Kenyon, and she never called the child by any name at all, just you and he. And then at last, when she was 29 and nearly hopeless, she had been released from her prison by Mr. Bruce Fawcett, who had taken her to California to a house very much like the one she had known in St. Louis, and all the niceties were restored to her that her father had taught her constituted reality. Mr. Fawcett, the children gathered, had been similar to Grandfather Bonnie, although he had been a fainter and imperfect copy. lacking the vitality of the original. For example, his jokes were never quoted, and the children doubted if he had ever made any. She had brought all the treasures that had been in the storage house these many years, and those she kept in Mr. Kenyon's house. The portrait of her father, his books, and the man himself. A heap of dust in a graceful urn whose handles were shaped like flat-headed snakes, and whose top ended in a little knob shaped like a water lily. Both Mr. Kenyon and his stepdaughter dreaded his annual visit, but they looked upon it as a duty which they would not have dreamed of shirking. He set forth from home on the first day of August, visiting first his Oklahoma place, and then his Longhorn Ranch in the Panhandle, and after a short trip to Mexico to buy presents for the children, he came on to Covina. Once the courteous preliminaries were over, Grandpa seemed to enjoy his stay, for he was fond of the children, especially of Ralph and Molly, whose coloring was that of their grandmother and their half-uncle, and curiously enough, of himself. But Mrs. Fawcett enjoyed none of it, and for the whole 2 weeks was so flustered that when he left she always went to bed for 3 or 4 days with a prolonged sick headache. To the children this visit was a season as special and as separate as Christmas or Easter, and the days before he came they conjectured what surprises he would bring with him this time, in his big, shabby grip, crammed with stiff socks and dirty shirts and scraps of useless paper with the writing worn off. All other visitors wrapped up their presents in tissue paper and tied them with ribbon, but Grandpa just handed them out of the way he had got them, sometimes loosely wrapped in a crumpled piece of cheese paper. These gifts were not the sort of souvenirs the children saw in the boardwalk shops at Redondo Beach, nor were they like their presents their aunt brought, toys for Ralph and Molly, hair ribbons and round combs for Leah and Rachel. Grandpa brought them heavy, handmade objects, rings and knives and boxes, and Ralph, ever since he could remember, had loved to hold something small but solid in the palm of his hand. Once Grandpa had given him a miniature contour globe made of Mexican silver. It was his favorite belonging. Mrs. Fawcett, while she did not conceal her regret that he was coming, made as extensive preparations for him as if he were someone like Aunt Rowena or Aunt Kathleen, whom she really welcomed, and for a week beforehand she threw the house into a turmoil of cleaning and arranging and putting away and getting out, not failing to remind the household from time to time that it was singularly obtuse in Mr. Kenyon to come at the very busiest time of the year when there was canning to do and when the nuts were being gathered. But there was no help for it. One of the precepts she had learned at her father's table was, never be near with your hospitality. Conventions, as a result, had grown up around these visits, so that just as they associated turkey with Thanksgiving and ham with Easter, the Fawcetts thought of duck and wild rice, of Sally Lunn, and fig preserves as the only possible fare on the night of Mr. Kenyon's arrival. And, on the last Sunday of the visit, Mr. and Mrs. Follansbee came to a buffet supper served on the front porch, at which they had chicken pie and hot biscuits with salmonberry jam. This supper was invariably a fiasco, but Mrs. Fawcett, an incorrigible ritualist, repeated it year after year. Mr. Follansbee was a voluble man, given to telling anecdotes, which usually involved a passage from Scripture or from Shakespeare, and he embarrassed Mr. Kenyon, reducing him to a glassy-eyed stupor, which Mrs. Fawcett earnestly strove to end by asking him questions about the people in Missouri of whom she had no desire to hear, nor he to speak. More often than not, he had a seizure of yawning, almost like a spell of some kind, and he yawned exactly like a dog, making a noise at the end that sounded like a thwarted howl. Except for this one evening, Mr. Kenyon's visit was not interrupted by any social occasions, and he was only that one time required to dress in what he called his store clothes. Mr. Follansbee, who had known her father, was the only man Mrs. Fawcett met, so to say, in the drawing room, and it would have been quite unthinkable for all concerned to invite any of the ladies of her various circles to be introduced to her stepfather. There existed between the two a cool formality, as if they actually had been estranged in some way and did not simply dislike one another. Ralph knew instinctively that it had always been like that, and this was one of the reasons his mother perplexed him. She was quite smiling and flirtatious with Mr. Follansbee, almost as silly as Leah and Rachel. But with Mr. Kenyon, in whose very own house she had lived for years and years, she acted like an impatient schoolteacher. And Mr. Kenyon, for his part, seemed shy and gawky. But there was no such aloofness between him and the younger children. He was amiably talkative with them and treated them as if they were men of about his age. They spent the hours with him after school, rambling till supper time through the orderly avenues between the lines of English walnut trees. He had been everywhere in the world and had hunted every animal indigenous to the North American continent: deer, antelope, moose, caribou, bighorn, and every game bird you could name. He had caught wild horses in Nevada and had tamed them into the littlest benches a man ever saw. He had killed rattlers as long as a man is tall. He had eaten alligator and said it had tasted like chicken. Two things he never had been partial to were possum and beaver tails, though some people counted them great delicacies. The old colored cook at Claude's place would as like eat beaver tails 3 times a day. It was natural, Ralph supposed, for girls not to be so interested in hunting as he was, but that did not give Leah and Rachel any right to say, as they had been doing all this year, that Grandpa made his stories up. They were obviously all true, and Molly, who was very smart, believed them. He thought he had never really liked his older sisters, that he had always suspected that they were not what Mrs. Fawcett called true blue, and that this turning against Grandpa proved that he had been right. Now, in the garden behind him and Molly, they were talking in low voices. They had many secrets, and were in love with 2 brothers named George and Kenneth Taliaferro, whom Ralph and Molly detested because they put bay rum on their hair, and they called Ralph Hot Water Faucet and Molly Cold Water Faucet. Now and again the girls' golden hair appeared over the tops of the tall flowers, as bright as the petals. They wore plaid hair ribbons to match their dresses. Leah's was blue and Rachel's was red. Their hair was as soft as down, and when it was washed and Mrs. Fawcett was brushing it, it crackled with electricity. She was ever so proud of it and said crossly, "Oh, this pesky stuff." They were very pretty girls. Their mother carefully protected their fair skin from sunburn and freckles, and it was uniformly the color of milk. There was a blue vein in Leah's high forehead which made her look delicate. Their faces were oval and narrow and somehow old-fashioned, like the tintypes and sepia photographs of their mother and aunts where they were young ladies. Their bones were small, and in time they would be prettily padded as Mrs. Fawcett's were. In addition to their winning faces, they had what the members of the Sorosis called the poise of ladies of 30. So complete at ease were they when they passed the cakes at tea or played duets, never having to be coaxed. Mr. and Mrs. Follansby, who were childless, were devoted to them in a way Mrs. Fawcett found quite touching and sad. After church, when he shook hands with her, the minister often said, "Rose, if you ever get tired of these 2 little ladies of quality, you know where you can bring them." Leah and Rachel kept this love alive by calling on them frequently and drinking cambric tea, and by making presents for them at Christmas and Easter, sending them valentines and making them May baskets. In return, the Follansbys gave them tokens of piety, small New Testaments, packets of Bible scenes, and books of a moral flavor. Ralph and Molly, for their part, wouldn't have been seen at a dogfight with either of the Follansbys. It was hard to believe that the 2 girls had had the same father and mother as Ralph and Molly, who were shy and sometimes impudent out of embarrassment. Since their illness, moreover, they had been thin, pallid, and runny-nosed. From some obscure ancestor they had inherited bad, uneven teeth and nearsighted eyes, so that they had to wear braces and spectacles. Their skin and hair and eyes were dark, and the truth of it was they always looked a little dirty. They were small for their age, but they had large bones, and it was predicted with pity that they would shoot up suddenly in that dreadful, ungainly way so many children do, going then through several years of coltishness painful to behold. They were so self-conscious that they could not sit on a chair without looking as if they had perched on a precarious cliff, and if they were suddenly addressed by a strange elder, they swallowed in the middle of their words and tears came to their eyes, steaming their glasses. They were always getting cut and bruised and bumped, and this seemed so inconsiderate. Of course it wasn't at all, the poor youngsters couldn't help it, but it was peculiar. When Mrs. Fawcett felt the way she did about injuries which could so easily turn into lockjaw. Last year Molly had run a sewing machine needle straight through her index finger, and Mrs. Fawcett had fainted clean away. This had seemed to all Mrs. Fawcett's friends not only a deliberate accident, but one brought on by the most reprehensible circumstances, for Molly was making a quilt on the machine, not to be outdone by Leah and Rachel, who were sewing their pieces together by hand in the regular way. At home, Ralph and Molly were hot-tempered and rebellious, but elsewhere were so easily intimidated that the enemies among their contemporaries called them cowards. And while Leah and Rachel had dozens of fast friends and were invited to innumerable slumber parties and donkey parties every year, Ralph and Molly had none but one another, and at Valentine's they had to stuff the boxes in each other's room at school, or they would not have gotten any at all. In some ways, the most disturbing thing about them was their precocity. Mrs. Follansby, who was discomforted by intellect in anyone, said that their reading excesses were very likely the result, not the cause, of their having to put on eyeglasses at such an early age. First they looked studious, and then they were studious. Their tastes, in point of fact, were not in advance of their years, and they really preferred Howard Pyle to Dickens, though they did make rather a show of themselves by memorizing the scene in which David Copperfield gets drunk and entangles himself in Steerforth's curtains. Their reputation really derived from their ability to say off the alphabetical syllables on the backs of the Encyclopedia Britannica, no volume of which they had ever opened except ref to sci, where Ralph, with great disappointment, had read the article on reproduction. There was only one thing about Molly he did not like, Ralph decided, and that was the way she copied him. It was natural for her to want to be a boy, who wouldn't? But he knew for a fact she couldn't be. Last week he had to speak sharply to her about wearing one of his outgrown Boy Scout shirts. He was glad enough for her to have it, but she had not taken the be prepared thing off the pocket, and he had to come out and say brutally, having that on a girl is like dragging the American flag in the dirt. He wished she would not tag along with him and Grandpa. How splendid it would be, he thought, if only the two of them went walking together. How fine if he could tell the cow joke by himself. He lay back on the lawn, crushing the little Lippia blossoms, feeling her eyes follow every movement he made. And then, as he had known she would do, she lay back too. The day seemed strange to him, the very air unusual. It did not possess quite the quality of a dream, but it lay beyond him as the days had done when he had scarlet fever, and all the noises on the first floor had been thin and ephemeral. He remembered that late one night he had seen the sky glow suddenly with heat lightning, and he called to Molly through the door that connected their rooms. Heat lightning for the sky is the same thing as scarlet fever for us. Sick as she was, she clapped her hands and cried back, "Oh, Ralph, you always think of things." He would have asked her now if she, too, felt funny, but he was afraid that if he shared it with her, the feeling would leave him. And so he lay in his selfish speechlessness, pursuing the red globules that sped downward behind his closed eyes. "Hey," said Molly, and abruptly sat up again. "Straw's cheaper," said Ralph automatically. He wished she wouldn't talk. "No, listen, I have made another poem." He opened his eyes in astonishment and looked at her. She was twisting her head around with excitement, and he realized that she had not been thinking the same thoughts he had at all, and that perhaps she had not even been looking at him when he lay back. Once Grandpa had said that Molly was a deep one, and Ralph almost thought this was true. He had said it because she insisted that she had learned Braille in kindergarten, and though people would explain to her that what she was thinking of was the beads on a frame which you moved about to learn to count, she replied, "I said I learned Braille, and I meant it." "Will you listen to my poem?" she said pleadingly. "How long is it?" Ralph did not care for poetry. "It's real little." And then, without waiting for him to say all right, she went on. "It's called Gravel," she said, "and this is it. Gravel, gravel, on the ground, lying there so safe and sound. Why is it you look so dead? Is it because you have no head?" "Say it again," said Ralph, puzzled now. And when she had repeated it, he said, "It doesn't make any sense. Gravel doesn't have a head." "That's what I said. Is it because you have no head?" "Well, I don't know what you're talking about." "You're merely jealous because you can't write poems yourself," said Molly, close to tears. She took her handkerchief out of the pocket of her middy and snuffled into it, and beginning to cry, she said, "Now you've gone and made me have another nosebleed." He did not even open his eyes. He knew that she didn't have a nosebleed. And he was so tired of her poems that he was just not going to make any effort to understand this one or to praise it. But neither did he want her to have a mad on him, because that would spoil Grandpa's arrival, and so he said, "Why don't you go write it down on a piece of paper, and then maybe I can get the drift of it." It was true that he could never hear things as well as he could see them, and until just this year he had always thought that the song was, "Oh, beautiful for spacious guys." I will, cried Molly, and she ran to the house, chanting her poem. Now, with her gone, he was completely at peace. The unusual feeling came over him again, and he held on to it. It was almost as if he were clutching his broad, mold-colored geography book to his chest. Later, Ralph felt he had, on that long afternoon, some prescience of what would happen when Grandpa Kenyon finally came. But probably he had not, and it was only desire that made him remember those hours as peculiar and significant, though they were without event.